Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to move through the second half of FDR's administration, laying out his second New Deal, which was an attempt by FDR to replace a lot of the first New Deal programs that had been thrown out by the Supreme Court. We talked last time about how some of the FDR's New Deal programs may have been unconstitutional. Well, the Supreme Court is going to rule them definitely unconstitutional. And so FDR is going to come out with a whole series of new programs to attempt to replace the ones that were destroyed. So here's the objectives for today. Let's take a moment, we'll pause, and move on. The Supreme Court declared key pillars of FDR's New Deal unconstitutional, specifically the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or administration, which attempted to stabilize farm prices by paying farmers not to plant, destroying livestock, stuff like that. Supreme Court is not going to allow that. The NRA, which was FDR's takeover of industry, attempts to set standards, wages, employment guidelines, things like that, is also going to be declared unconstitutional. And so FDR is going to have to find a way to replace these, but first he's going to have to go to war with the Supreme Court. Here's FDR's fireside chat attacking the Supreme Court, so take a moment to read and let's move on. FDR's assault on the Supreme Court took two basic forms. The first was FDR attempted to impose a mandatory retirement age on Supreme Court justices. If you've been with us this whole time, you hopefully, of course, remember that Supreme Court justices serve for life. And so by placing a mandatory retirement age, FDR could force out the older justices, who tended to be more conservative, and appoint newer, more liberal justices to replace them. This did not fly, and so FDR's second attack was an attempt to expand the Supreme Court by 5 new judges. This would allow FDR to appoint 5 new justices who agreed with him, outvoting the conservatives and making sure his New Deal would be interpreted as constitutional. Most people thought this was going too far. Attempts to bring the judicial branch of the government under FDR's direct control really went against the spirit of the separation of powers. And so there was significant pushback both from the public at large and from Congress at FDR's attempts to court pack. And so FDR, in the end, was unable to bring the Supreme Court under his sway. But FDR, of course, needed to pass programs to replace the New Deal programs that had been declared unconstitutional, and so he's going to pass his second New Deal. As part of doing this, he had to bring sort of reluctant members of Congress on board. He did this by attempting to purge the Democratic Party of anyone who didn't support his New Deal programs. And so FDR tried to get Democrats kicked out of the party. He tried to get Democratic members of Congress expelled. Congress in general did not go along with this, but this is yet another example of FDR trying to greatly expand his power at the expense of the other branches of government. The second New Deal was an attempt to sort of solve the problems created by the destruction of the NRA and the AAA. So, for example, the AAA is now gone, so instead we're going to get federal crop insurance. And the NRA is now gone, so we're going to get all these other things. We're going to get work programs. We're going to get aid for the poor as like the precursor to food stamps. We're going to get aid to retirees from the whole and disabled people through Social Security. The TVA is going to be codified as the Rural Electrification Administration, which is now covering all of the country. And the National Youth Administration is going to replace some of the other works programs that we'd seen before. And so the second New Deal is both longer lasting and probably more ambitious than the first New Deal. And it was an attempt to solve the problems of the first New Deal being declared unconstitutional and also secure FDR support for his re-election campaign in 1936. Here's FDR's signing of Social Security, which is one of the hallmarks of the American social safety net. So take a moment, pause, and read. Social Security is, of course, spectacularly long-lasting, providing identification numbers for everyone and creating old age pensions for the elderly and payments to disabled people. This comes out of people's paycheck every month through payroll taxes and creates a sort of mandatory savings and retirement plan for the elderly. It's one of the most enduringly popular programs of FDR's New Deal, despite the fact that it's substantially underfunded and probably will definitely run out of money at some point, unless we fund it better or find some workaround. We've been slowly raising the retirement age for it, but that's also spectacularly unpopular. So I'm sure Congress is going to come up with some reasonable solution for this any day now. The Rural Electrification Administration is gonna supersede the TVA, expanding it out to other areas that happen to not be the Tennessee River Valley. And so we're going to be providing electrification, hydroelectric dams, and trying to provide power to rural areas where power companies previously were not providing service because it was not overall profitable. So here's the TVA being extended out. Take a moment, pause, and read, and then we'll move on. The Wagner Act further empowered labor unions. As you hopefully remember, during the Roaring Twenties, Chief Justice William Taft, in Coronado Mine Workers, ruled that labor unions could again be charged under the Sherman Antitrust Act as an illegal sort of monopoly of labor. The Wagner Act was an attempt to overturn these policies from the Roaring Twenties, making it legal for unions to organize, collectively bargain, and take collective action such as strikes without being prosecuted for an illegal monopoly of labor. And so in the election of 1936, FDR is running as a relatively popular president despite the fact that the New Deal had not solved the problems of the Great Depression. The Republicans nominate Alf Landon of Kansas, and the second New Deal is just being passed at this point. And so with the second New Deal, Alf Landon is going to really struggle to get any traction against FDR, both because of the massive reach of these New Deal programs and also because of FDR's mastery of the radio and other media, taking up a lot of the sort of airspace the attention of the American people. And so Alf Landon is more or less a sacrificial lamb who's going to be crushed by the popular wave of FDR, as we see here. And so FDR has a broad mandate to go forward with his second New Deal and continue to reform American society. The strength of FDR is from what's called the New Deal Coalition. So here are the various groups that are part of FDR's New Deal Coalition. This is going to be the heart of the support of the Democratic Party throughout most of the 20th century. And the general weakening of the Democratic Party in the second half of the 20th century is going to come from various groups in this New Deal coalition being peeled off to start supporting the Republicans. But for right now, FDR gets his support from former progressives who believe, of course, that the government should be solving people's problems. White Southerners who support generally these New Deal actions plus hate the Republican Party. Minority groups who got support from a lot of FDR's New Deal programs through things like, the federal crop insurance and through the Indian Reorganization Act. Labor unions and sort of low-wage workers because of the Wagner Act. And farmers because of the passage of crop insurance. And so this is going to create a pretty lasting and durable coalition, allowing the Democrats to dominate a number of elections from here really up until civil rights starts to peel some of these groups off. Because obviously, although a lot of these groups have similar economic interests, their social interests vary pretty severely. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on that. So as far as successes of the New Deal did put a lot of people back to work and provided people with hope, both by providing them with jobs and money, and by also giving them the sense that FDR was in charge through his sort of fireside chats, the idea that there is this president out there who's connecting with the people and trying to bring us along. And so that was successful. We also get success as far as things like FDIC and Social Security. We get the passage of minimum wages or the creation of minimum wages, which are going to become sort of a staple of the American economy going forward. And Native Americans are going to get reservations again through the Indian Reorganization Act. And FDR, through a lot of his second New Deal programs, created the vast majority, or at least the beginnings, of our social safety net in the United States. And of course, we're going to greatly expand that in the 60s, and we'll talk about that in future lectures. As far as failures of the New Deal, FDR's New Deal never really got unemployment out of the way and never really dropped the unemployment rate back to the pre-Depression standards. The works programs were never vast enough in order to make a huge dent in this. And even, the things designed to restart the economy didn't really do it. And so cyclical unemployment was still a thing. The sort of structural problems were still a thing. And it really wasn't until the 1940s, with mobilization for World War II, that we started to get back to these pre-war levels. Despite his best efforts, FDR also ran substantial deficits, starting us on a pattern of unsustainability. In the end, although he did pass tax increases, they wouldn't pay for his social safety net programs. And because we've created this social safety net, we can now not get rid of it. And so, because of that, federal spending is going to outpace federal revenue for the foreseeable future, especially after the war. And then we're going to have all this military spending during the Cold War. And so, for all of these reasons, balancing the federal budget is going to be a problem from us here on out. And so, consistent debt and deficits are going to become part of this class moving forward. We also, according to some critics of Roosevelt, we've also veered into socialism. Providing this social safety net does, to some degree, take away incentives for individuals to work. And of course, if that social safety net becomes too sort of generous, it really creates a drag on the American economy and creates a number of other sort of unforeseen problems. The federal government also provided a lot of aid to states, and a lot of that aid was given out unequally. And so, despite the fact that African Americans did switch to the Democratic Party in order to support FDR, as far as gaining from New Deal organizations, Black people were often left out of a lot of these programs. This is, of course, noted by African American advocates who are pushing FDR to make changes here. But FDR was hesitant to do anything to explicitly help out African Americans for risk of alienating white Southerners. And so this is going to be one of the major challenges for Democratic politicians going forward, is how do you continue to exist in a coalition that has both Jim Crow supporting white Southerners and also African Americans? And so that's going to be a problem for Democrats moving forward. So as far as FDR's legacy, in a very real sense, he's created the standard by which Democratic presidents are to be judged, and honestly, to some degree, all presidents. The whole standard of the first 100 days is going to be enduring past FDR. The sort of phrase New Deal has become part of our political lexicon. And this idea that it's the government's job to provide a social safety net and to guarantee economic opportunity for people has really become baked into our political understanding. And so FDR profoundly changed both the size and scope of government, but he also profoundly changed what we expect from government. And that's a really tough sort of that's a really tough expectation to remove once it's set. And so FDR really did profoundly change the American presidency and American society. The idea that like Roosevelt gave us a little bit of socialism to save us from a lot of socialism is pretty powerful. So we'll take a moment, pause, and move on. As far as critics of the Roosevelt administration, a lot of his programs were very questionably constitutional. And once we agreed to pass a variety of things like Social Security, crop insurance, stuff like that, it really changed the bar as far as what necessary and proper was. It lowered the bar and lowered the net, metaphorically, as far as what was constitutional, and set a precedent that you can more or less do anything you want with the necessary and proper clause. And it's going to make it very hard for the Supreme Court in the future to declare things unconstitutional. It also forever disrupted the balance of power between Congress and the president, moving more and more authority to the executive at the expense of the other two branches of government. And the president is going to take on an increasingly important role throughout the rest of the 20th century and even to today, with us expecting the president to pass broad, sweeping legislation to address society's problems, or else he's going to be viewed as a failure, whether or not that's reasonable or even desirable. So FDR's legacy is a profound change in what we expect from the American government, both positive and negative, and a profound change in the balance between the various branches of government. And so that's where we'll leave it for today. There's some foreign policy stuff that we're going to have to get into before ending this unit. And so we'll talk about American foreign policy and especially Roosevelt's involvement in the increasingly volatile situations in both Europe and Asia. So for now, we'll leave you here. Thank you for listening.